Hello, cats and kittens. Thanks for being here. Your next presenter is a senior software technical lead for Home Chef and host of the Day as a Dev podcast, where he interviews developers from all walks of life to offer students and those interested in tech a practical look at life in the industry. So please welcome Kevin Lesht.
Thank you, Aji, and thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know, my name is Kevin Lesht, and my talk today is titled From Request to Response and Everything in Between. Well, most everything in between. Okay, some stuff in between. Turns out there's a lot, and so today we're mostly going to focus on how requests move through our app environments to receive a response, and how we can configure our app environments to handle a lot of requests coming in all at once. But first, a little about me. I work at Home Chef, where I'm a member of our engineering team, and I've been with Home Chef for 8 years. So it's a pretty great place to work, and it's also given me the experience to see a whole lot of different traffic patterns as our business has grown. Over the years, I'd sort of followed the work that our platform team was doing to manage all the traffic, but it really wasn't until producing this talk that I felt like I had a solid grasp on everything going on. And so what I've bundled up here is what I wish I had 8 years ago. 2 other quick notes before we get started. First, in 2022, I gave a talk at RailsConf titled Geolocation Explained, which went into IP address networking, fundamental database operations, and query performance tuning. And the deck for that talk came in at 187 slides. I didn't think there was any chance that I would ever go beyond that. But here we are today, sitting at 359 slides for this talk. So buckle up and try not to blink. Second note is on giving credit where credit is due. This talk was built off of a ton of research from resources provided by the community, and in particular, Nate Berkopek's work on and around Puma. All of that research will be linked at the end, and I definitely encourage you to check it out if you're interested in learning more about any of the things we cover. Now, on to the show. So I woke up this morning, and as I do every day, I made myself an omelet, and I took a picture and posted that picture to my omelet blog, 5minutesandaflip.com. Plating was not so great on this one, but we'll talk more about that later. Now, 5 Minutes and a Flip is a Rails app, because why not? And so to produce that web page, what we're all probably familiar with is a request coming into our app, the router pointing that request to a controller, the controller running any action logic, and then a response, like a view render, being returned. But what's really happening here? How does that request even make it through our app environment to receive a response? And what happens when we have a lot of them coming in all at once? So to begin, we're going to start by looking at a Rails environment configured to only handle one request at a time. This means that when a request is sent to a DNS record, like 5minutesandaflip.com, and directed to the backing IP address, our hosting provider's load balancer will then accept that request and direct it to a server where it's received by the server socket. Our web application server will then send that request to our Rails process where it's serviced by a thread and returned a response. And only after we return a response will our process be available to accept another request for work. Should other requests come in while we're in the process of servicing a request, those other requests are held on the server socket in a queue. Now, if you're like me, you've probably experienced this firsthand without ever really appreciating it. Going back to the omelet blog, really trying to make this thing go viral, by the way. Tell your friends. My plating abilities aren't the only issue going on with the site here. We do have a few bugs. And so we decided to give one of those a look by throwing a debugger, like a binding.pry, into our favorite problematic part of the app. We then send a web request to catch it, But just then, we get a little distracted and want to visit some other page on our site. So we open up a new tab and try to go to localhost 3000/best omelets. Only that request stalls. Nothing loads. Then, if you're luckier than me, you somewhat quickly remember that you have a pry in place, and it's holding that earlier request open. Until you release that pry and allow that request to return a response, all other incoming requests, like the later visit, are held at the socket and entered into a queue until our process is available to accept new work. Then, once we finally let go of that pry, our process can finish servicing that first request to return a response and signal that it's ready for new work, at which point our socket will provide our process with a next request off of the queue. And so although our pry example here, where a request is left open for a long amount of time and blocking other requests from being accepted until a response can be returned, is something that we'd really only hit in our development environments, it's a good illustration of what might happen in a system where only one request can be handled at a time. Now, I do want to call out that request queues are a good thing. The alternative would be that if our process wasn't in a position to accept a new request, then without a queue, any other incoming request would just be rejected. And so our queue helps us hold on to any incoming requests while our process is busy, until it's in a position to accept new work. To frame this as a real-world example, let's use our getting into RailsConf. Could not work myself into the slide, by the way. Come on. In our example, we'll have one of our fantastic volunteers working at a station for moving attendees into the conference, and a big long line of attendees. The volunteer accepts an attendee who presents their ticket for scanning, and the volunteer then grabs the attendee's name badge and t-shirt, hands it off to them, and sends the attendee into the conference. Once that attendee has moved through the station, the volunteer can now accept another attendee where the same process would then repeat. The line of attendees here can be thought of as requests waiting on our server socket. Our station can be thought of as a Rails process, and our volunteer can be thought of as a thread within that process. Now, our volunteers at RailsConf are amazing. They're able to get our attendees into the conference super quickly. And just the same, a performant Rails app will be able to process a request super quickly. But RailsConf is a pretty popular conference, and I'm sure all of our Rails apps are popular too. So even with the best volunteers and the best Rails apps, if we're limited to only handling one attendee or request at a time, and the traffic we receive outpaces the time it takes to process that traffic, then our request queue is just going to grow longer and longer and longer. So we really want to be able to handle more than one request at a time. But we set our environment up as a system only able to service one request at a time. So how the heck do we then work on multiple requests and all at once? Well, let's think about how we'd approach this in our RailsConf example. Right now, we've only got one station and one lonely volunteer responsible for managing everybody trying to get into RailsConf. And they're great, but they need some help. So we call up a friend. And now we've got two volunteers, each with their own station. We've still got our big long line of attendees trying to get into the conference, but now any open station can accept an attendee, where a volunteer can scan their ticket, get their name badge, t-shirt, and send the attendee they're working with into the conference. And then again, accept a new attendee to repeat the process. By adding more stations, we've expanded our ability to take attendees off of the queue, and we've increased the throughput of attendees able to enter the conference. Just like that, we've now doubled our capacity for work. So if we were looking to apply this to our Rails environments, well, we'd simply spin up more processes. Yes, it's time to talk about web application servers, which for our conversation is going to be Puma. There are other web application servers out there that you can use to manage your Rails infrastructure, like Unicorn or Passenger and others. And for the most part, what we'll talk about today would apply when using those as well. So Puma is a web server that handles requests and offers a system for managing the processes that are going to be servicing those requests. And I say processes here because with Puma, it doesn't have to be just one process per server. Puma is capable of booting multiple processes per server. There's a general rule of thumb that you can run a Rails process for each CPU core provided by your server. Now, each one of these processes will still only be working on one request at a time, but at least now we can handle a request for each process that we have running, and all at the same time. As requests arrive at our server, Puma will direct those requests to any process available for work. Should requests come in while all of our processes are busy, they'll be held on the server socket in the request queue until any one of our processes becomes available to accept a new request for work. So we now have a system capable of handling multiple requests and all at the same time. But how do we know how many requests we might need to handle at the same time? Well, to answer that question, let's recenter around what our number of processes, whatever that number might be, is offering. Knowing that each process is running a single thread, and each thread can only service one request at a time, then all our process count offers us is a total number of requests that can be worked on at any given point in time. And knowing that we need to service requests faster than the pace we receive them so that our queue doesn't back up, there's then two parameters that we can look to for reaching an equation that provides an optimal number of processes. And those parameters are the number of requests that we're receiving per second, what we can call our request arrival rate, and the average total time it takes to process one of those requests, where total time is going to represent the amount of time a request spends in the queue in addition to the amount of service time. To visualize this, let's go back to our example of getting into RailsConf. Say we've got 5 attendees arriving per second, and a volunteer at one of our stations can process an attendee in 75 milliseconds. Told you our volunteers were fantastic. Totally reasonable amount of time right there. At this pace, the first attendee wouldn't spend any time in line. They walk right into a station where our volunteer scans their ticket, grabs their name badge and t-shirt, moves them through the door in 75 milliseconds. The next attendee has now been waiting in line for 75 milliseconds while that first attendee was being serviced. But now that our station is open for work, our second attendee makes it through the doors in 75 milliseconds. Our next attendee has now been waiting in line for 150 milliseconds and makes it through the door in another 75 milliseconds. The fourth attendee has now been waiting in line for 225 milliseconds, makes it through the door in another 75 milliseconds. Finally, our fifth attendee has now been waiting in line for 300 milliseconds and makes it through the door in 75 milliseconds. And as we're carrying along here, working to get our attendees into the conference, at each second, another 5 attendees show up. And now they need to be handled just the same. And so to make sure that we're able to keep up with our arrival rate of attendees, so that our queue doesn't grow to an unmanageable state, we need to ensure that the time it takes to clear our arrival rate falls less than our arrival rate. In our example, if 5 attendees are showing up every 1 second, then we need to make sure that we're moving all 5 of those attendees through the doors in at most 1 second of time before another 5 are going to show up. Any more time than that, and our volunteer wouldn't be able to keep up. And our queue would grow to a place where attendees became unhappy waiting in line for so long. So if we were to frame this around web requests, here we have a breakdown of 5 requests and the time they're spending in the queue, and then after being serviced, the total time it took from the moment the request arrived at our server to the moment that request received a response. And if we were to sum up all of the total response times and then divide by the number of requests that arrived in our 1 second window, we'd see that in this case here, our average response time is 225 milliseconds, which isn't terrible for an average response time, but our total time to process those 5 requests comes in at 1,125 milliseconds, or 125 milliseconds over 1 second in time. And so with a request arrival rate of 5 requests per second, now when the next 5 requests show up, we're already running behind schedule. Where that first request from our first set of traffic was accepted right away and experienced a wait time in the queue of 0 milliseconds, now in this next set of traffic, that first request will need to wait 125 milliseconds before it begins to be serviced. Summing up our total response times and dividing that number by total requests, we can see that our average response time has now jumped to 350 milliseconds. And if we again take the sum of total response times, we're now at 1,750 milliseconds, or 750 milliseconds over that 1 second marker in time. And so we're compounding the issue of our queue backing up. As the next second turns over and another 5 requests arrive, now the first request in this set of traffic is waiting 750 milliseconds in the queue before it can be accepted for work. And one more time, summing total response times and dividing by number of requests, now our average response time lands at 975 milliseconds, with our total response time landing at about 5 seconds, or about 4 seconds over that 1 second marker. So what started as a little overage of 125 milliseconds has quickly run away from us. Luckily, we can use our parameters of request arrival rate and average total response time to reach a number of processes that'll put us in a place where we can keep up with our pace of traffic. Here's that equation. Request arrival rate multiplied by average total response time equals number of processes. Plugging our numbers in from that first set of requests, with a request arrival rate of 5 requests per second and an average total response time of 225 milliseconds, we would want to have a little over 1 process available to keep pace. And we want to round up here because otherwise we're falling behind. And as we saw, that's quickly going to get away from us. So to manage our traffic here, we'd want to bring in a second process to work on requests. Moving back to our traffic pattern, now with 2 processes available, 2 requests can be picked up right away with no wait time in the queue. Each one can be serviced in 75 milliseconds, and then a next 2 requests can be picked up, and so on and so on. Again, taking the sum of our total response time and dividing by number of requests, now we land at an average response time of 135 milliseconds, and a total time to process our set of traffic at 675 milliseconds, putting us well on pace to process our queue at a faster pace than our arrival rate, so that our queue doesn't back up. Now, there's one other component of our equation to call out, and that is, in real-world scenarios, we're going to be dealing with some variability, maybe a lot of variability. When looking at performance monitoring services, a request arrival rate is usually going to be presented as requests per minute, and so we won't really have eyes on any bursts or downturns in traffic within that 1 minute, which makes translating that request per minute to request per second a little fuzzy. And that number of requests per minute might be changing from 1 minute to the next. On the app servicing side of things, we might have fast endpoints and slow endpoints, and some in the middle. And the things happening inside of our application might be subject to some change. If our traffic were to start behaving a little differently, like moving from primarily hitting our fast endpoints to our slow ones, or if our software started behaving a little differently, like if a third-party API request started to return more slowly, our service time might also be subject to change. So to navigate around this variability, we had a buffer into our equation. And that's going to offer us some space to confidently handle the uncertainties that come from facing the real world. Nate Berkopec, in his talk Determining Ruby Process Counts, notes that from his experience, he's found that we tend to best process requests when we're operating at about a 25% processing capacity. And so the multiplier that we'll introduce into our equation is going to be 4. Now running our formula one more time with our multiplier taken into account, we'd find that with a request arrival rate of 5 requests per second and an average response time of 225 milliseconds, 5 requests per second multiplied by 225 milliseconds multiplied by 4 would land us at 4.5 processes, which, rounding up, because we don't want to risk falling behind, lands us at 5 processes to confidently manage our traffic pattern. What's great about this formula is, by coming to a number of processes for confidently handling our traffic, not only are we able to provide our site visitors with the best response times that we can, but by knowing how to handle traffic, as we see those traffic parameters change, we can scale our number of processes up or down to best accommodate our visitors while also managing our resources. Should we get hit by a large influx of traffic or see response time slow down, we can scale up our number of processes. And then when that traffic dissipates or our response time decreases, we can scale back down to make sure that we don't have needless server resources online. So now that we have a good handle on how a process running a single thread operates and a good handle on understanding how many of those processes we might need online to handle various traffic patterns, let's talk about another scaling option that we have available to us: multi-threaded processes. So we've set up a process running a single thread as a system that's only capable of working on one request at a time. A request sent to our site hits our server socket, our process accepts the request for work, a thread services that request, and until a response to that request can be returned, any other incoming request is held in the socket on a queue. Well, in a multi-threaded system, we can configure our process to accept and service many requests, and all at the same time. In this kind of design, as requests arrive at our server, each thread that's available for work can accept a request off of the socket and service it. And then, just the same as in our single-threaded process, should all of our threads be busy, any other requests at our server are held in the queue until responses are returned and threads again become available for new work. So, if we want to increase our capacity for handling requests, we can just spin up more threads, right? Well, we can, but there's a couple important things to note here. The first being, in order to run a multi-threaded process, your application code and all of the libraries that you might be using must be thread safe. Now, we don't have the time in this talk to get into what ensures a thread-safe process, but I do have some resources included at the end so that you can assess your own application to determine if multi-threading is for you. What we'll focus on here is the other important thing to know, because it's a pretty big thing. Rails being built on Ruby comes with what's called the global VM lock. The GVL is a mechanism that keeps our Ruby code running safe. And the way it does that is by only allowing one thread within a process to execute Ruby code at a time. So if we have a process running multiple threads and we've accepted multiple requests for work, how are those threads all supposed to service our requests at the same time? Well, in a typical Rails application, and in particular a Rails application where you might really benefit from running multiple threads, there are other things than Ruby happening within our requests to produce a response. Things we might call I/O operations, like database queries or waiting on network data, like from a request to a third-party API. To really visualize this, let's go back to our RailsConf example one more time. In our example, demonstrating a single-threaded process, when an attendee gets accepted by a volunteer for servicing, our volunteer scans their ticket, grabs their name badge, t-shirt, and sends the attendee into the conference. At which point, our volunteer can accept a next attendee from the queue to be serviced just the same. Well, let's say we now have 3 volunteers all working the same station. Right away, our 3 volunteers can each accept an attendee for servicing, and all at the same time. But here's the catch. Our station only has one ticket scanning machine to be shared across all 3 volunteers. Well, as our volunteers are working, our one ticket scanning machine needs to be passed between each volunteer to scan each attendee's ticket. But while an attendee is waiting for their ticket to be scanned, the volunteer working with them can run off to fetch their name badge and t-shirt. So even though our one ticket scanning machine imposes a limitation on some of what our volunteers are able to do, while a volunteer is waiting on that machine, they're still able to accomplish other things. Framing this against our Rails environment, the GVL can be thought of as our ticket scanning machine. In a process running multiple threads, when a thread needs to run some Ruby code, it requests the GVL, which is then applied to the thread. And meanwhile, other threads servicing a request within that process can be doing other non-Ruby things. Now, I've chosen 3 as the number of threads for our example, because if you're running a multi-threaded Puma process, that's the default value that the Rails community has landed on as an optimal number of threads. Took a long time to get to that number. But to better understand how many threads we might want to run within our process, let's look back at a traffic pattern being handled by one process running a single thread. When a set of requests arrive at our server running one process with a single thread, each request is processed serially, one after the other. And every request but the first spends some amount of time in the request queue. In this example here, our total time to process those 5 requests lands at a little over a second. But looking at that same traffic pattern as handled by one process running 3 threads, our process can now accept 3 requests from the socket right out of the gate to service them all in parallel, leading to a much shorter wait time across the queue. In this example, our total time to process those 5 requests lands at 560 milliseconds. And this is great. Our multi-threaded process is now handling requests at about twice the speed as our single-threaded process. What you might have already noticed, though, is that in our multi-threaded example here, I've increased the service time a bit. And that's to simulate the time that we're introducing on each request as it waits for the GVL. Remember, within a Rails process, the GVL limits us to only running Ruby code within one thread at a time. And so at some point or another, each thread is going to be requesting the GVL to be able to execute some Ruby and waiting should the GVL be in use on another thread and unavailable. It's an important thing to highlight because you can reach a point of too many threads where the competition between threads requesting and waiting on the GVL causes your service times to skyrocket. And so to tune your application for an optimal number of threads, you'll need to perform some benchmark testing. Now, if you do find yourself in a spot where running multiple threads has led to an increase in response times, you might still come to the decision that the added time is something you're comfortable accepting. The questions to ask would be, do I want response times to be as quick as they can, but with that coming from more servers online to house processes running with a lesser amount of threads? Or do I want to be able to accept more requests with less processes, which means I don't have to bring as many server resources online, but at the trade-off of longer response times? This is really only something that you'll be able to answer for your application and business values, but hopefully the material here provides a starting point in understanding what's at play and a framework for beginning to think about these kinds of decisions. Now, pivoting just a bit here, there's one other element of our system where we need to manage requests or connections, and it's something we haven't talked about just yet: the database. Earlier, we established that for each process that we're running, we have the capability to bring online any number of threads within that process, where each thread can be working on a request. And as a part of working on a request, a thread might need to query our database for data. And at any given moment, it might not be just one thread calling for data, but all of them in parallel. To demonstrate how this works, let's talk about Active Records Connection Pool. The connection pool is a service that lives on our Rails process, and its job is to synchronize thread access to a defined number of database connections. Whenever a thread needs to query for data, it'll call the connection pool to check out a database connection, use that connection to execute its query, and then after a result is returned for the query, check the connection back into the pool where it again becomes available for use. Now, a connection can only be used by one thread at a time, and so if we have more threads asking for connections than are available, the connection pool will queue those connection requests until a connection does become available. If a connection request waits for too long, it'll error out as the timeout limit expires. So in order to ensure that we don't introduce an additional point of queuing within our system, which could lead to increased response times and even requests timing out, we want to provide our Rails process with a database connection for each thread that it's running. Or said another way, when setting the database connection pool for a process, we'll want our number of available database connections for that process to be equal to the maximum number of threads for the process. This will ensure that every thread on a process can connect to the database in parallel and without any time spent waiting. Now, there is one important note here, and it's something to keep in mind when scaling. Your database technology is most likely going to come with a connection limit. And this is something you'll need to factor in when determining how many processes and threads your system might be capable of running. Consider a database where the hosting provider of that database has enabled 20 connections for use. In a system like we've set up in the talk here, where we might have 4 processes online within a server and 3 threads running within each of those processes, well, in a system like this, we'd want to make 3 database connections available per process, 1 for each thread. And this would land us at a total of 12 connections that might be used by our server. Should our traffic pattern reach a point where we need to bring another server online, that's 12 more connections, which would put our total number of possible connections at 24. And we only have access to 20. So what happens? Well, remember, the connection pool on a process doesn't hold its connection open at all times. Connections are instead checked out by threads as needed and closed when no longer in use. But even still, should we be firing on all cylinders with our threads all working and requesting data, we could reach a point where all possible connections are in use. And if we were to try and exceed our connection limit, requests would error out on no connection available. So the connection limit is an important thing to consider, as it really sets a ceiling on how far we're able to scale by number of processes and threads. Consider, too, that apart from the database connections we might need to support our web servers, we'll also want to factor in an appropriate amount of connections for servers running background jobs, and we'll also want to factor in a little buffer space for one-off processes like council sessions and other tasks. So if it's looking like you may be approaching the max number of connections supported by your database, it'd be time to work with your database hosting provider and upgrade to an offering with a higher number of connections. Otherwise, should we receive a large traffic pattern, we wouldn't be able to manage that traffic, as we'd be limited in the number of workable threads that we could bring online by connections available on our database. All right, we have come a long way. Let's put it all together, starting from the top. Need a breath first. When a connection is sent to our site, like 5minutesinaflip.com, our hosting provider's load balancer will then accept that request and direct it to a listener socket on our server. Our web application server will then direct that request to our Rails process, where it's serviced and returned a response. And only after we return a response can our process accept another request for work. Should other requests arrive while a request is being processed, those requests are held in a request queue on our server socket until our process is available to accept new work. To keep pace with our traffic, we can multiply our average response time by our request arrival rate while factoring in a little buffer to reach a number of processes that we should bring online to make sure that we're processing requests quick enough so that our queue doesn't back up. And we can bring processes online up to the number of CPU cores available on our server. If we find that we need more processes online than our server can support, then we can bring more servers online. And all the while, we can be running multiple threads within each process. If we're running multiple threads within a process, we need to remember that Ruby's GVL limits us to only running Ruby code on one of those threads at a time. But as other non-Ruby things can be happening across all threads at the same time, with one of those non-Ruby things being database queries, for each thread that we're running, we want to ensure that a database connection is available, as each thread can check out a connection to run queries. And to prevent database connections from timing out, we want to make sure that we actually have enough connections available. That's the full picture right there, a totally easy diagram to digest and illustrate everything that happens from request to response. But wait, there's more. Some of what happens from request to response. There is still so much more out there to cover, and that's where you come in. One closing note on some of the other stuff that we weren't able to cover in this talk. Each one of these things could probably be a talk in itself. So give them a look and bring what you've learned back to the community. With that, I'll see you at the next and last RailsConf. Thank you.